The July sun hung over Fort Blackstone like a burning anvil. Heat shimmered off the tarmac in waves that made the distant mountains look like they were melting. The shuttle bus's brakes hissed as it pulled to a stop outside the main gate. The door folded open with a metallic groan. Staff Sergeant Sloan Brennan stepped down onto asphalt that had already been baking since dawn. Her boots found purchase on ground marked by decades of military vehicles. Tire tracks, oil stains, the permanent scars of purpose and discipline. She was 27 years old, brown hair pulled back in regulation precision, eyes the color of winter sky. Her woodland pattern BDUs showed the kind of wear that came from actual service, not parade ground posturing. The M4 rifle case slung over her shoulder carried weight beyond its physical measure. Fort Blackstone, Nevada, middle of nowhere, exactly where the branches sent their best to prove who was better. Sloan moved across the compound with the efficiency of someone who'd been wearing boots for nearly a decade. Her eyes tracked everything: guard towers, training facilities, exit routes, the kind of situational awareness that became second nature in places where inattention got you killed. Somewhere beyond the concrete hangars, she could hear the rhythmic thunder of morning PT, boots hitting ground in perfect unison, cadence calls echoing off steel and stone. This base held ghosts for her, not the kind that haunted, the kind that drove you forward. 2 years ago, her father had died in a hospital bed at Walter Reed. Cancer. The enemy you couldn't outfight or outthink. General Thomas Hawk Brennan, 61 years old, Cold War operative, Gulf War hero, the man who'd created something called Falcon Protocol, the man who'd never once told his daughter he was proud of her. Sloan pushed that thought down deep where it belonged. She had a job to do. Colonel Archer Calloway had personally requested her transfer to Blackstone. Temporary duty assignment, joint training exercise. That's what the order said. But Archer had been her father's best friend for 35 years. He didn't do anything without a reason. The armory smelled exactly like every armory she'd ever been in. Gun oil, metal polish, the sharp tang of industrial cleaners trying to cover decades of testosterone and competition. Behind the wire mesh counter, 4 men in navy blue combat shirts stood clustered together. Their conversation died the moment she walked in. Lieutenant Garrett Wolfe noticed her first. Tall, blonde, built like he'd been assembled from a recruiting poster template. Pale blue eyes that assessed everyone as either asset or obstacle. He looked her up and down with the kind of practiced sweep that was meant to make you feel small. "Well, well," he announced to his companions. "Look what the Army sent us. Hope she knows which end of the rifle shoots." The others laughed. Easy. Comfortable. The sound of men who'd run together long enough to finish each other's sentences and reinforce each other's sense of superiority. Chief Dalton Sterling leaned against the counter with casual authority. Red-haired, weathered face that spoke of real experience, not just training exercises. 39 years old. He'd seen combat. You could tell by the way his eyes never fully relaxed. Petty Officer Beckett Rhodes stood with arms crossed, muscular in the way that came from obsessive weight room dedication. Dark-haired, Pennsylvania working class written in every line of his posture. The kind who needed to prove his strength constantly because strength was all he had. Corporal Finley Nash bounced slightly on the balls of his feet. Nervous energy given human form. 26 years old with an Appalachian accent thick enough to cut. He snickered at Garrett's comment like it was the wittiest thing he'd heard all week. "Don't worry, Lieutenant," Beckett called out. "We'll keep her safe out there. Make sure she doesn't trip over her own bootlaces." Finley snorted. "Maybe we should get her a safety manual. You know, military weapons for dummies." Sloan didn't bite. She'd heard variations of this conversation in a dozen different languages across 3 continents. She signed for her M4 with methodical precision, pulled it across the counter, started her inspection routine without a word. Chamber check, sight alignment, sling adjustment. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that came from handling weapons in places where malfunction meant more than failing an exercise. "Easy there, killer," Dalton said from behind her. His voice carried something different than the others. Not mockery, something else. Observation. "Those training rounds won't hurt anyone unless you point them the right way." Finley leaned over to Beckett. "I heard she's more PowerPoint warrior than trigger puller anyway. Probably hasn't seen real action since Bush was president. Sloan finished her weapons check, slung the rifle across her chest with practiced efficiency. When she finally looked up, her expression revealed nothing. No anger, no hurt, nothing they could use. "Guess we'll find out," she said simply. Then she turned and walked toward the briefing room. Behind her, she caught Garrett's voice dropping to what he probably thought was a whisper. "$20 says she folds the first time someone gets aggressive." Sloan kept walking. She'd been underestimated by better men than these four. It never lasted long. The smart play was letting them think whatever made them comfortable. Reality had a way of correcting misconceptions. What none of them knew was simple. Sloan Brennan carried more than just her own service record. She carried a legacy built over decades. A system of combat her father had spent a lifetime perfecting. A protocol named after a bird of prey that struck faster than its target could comprehend. And somewhere in this base, Colonel Archer Calloway was watching everything unfold exactly according to plan. The briefing room had been a storage hangar in a previous life. All concrete floors and exposed metal rafters. Folding tables shoved against walls to make room for rows of uncomfortable chairs. A whiteboard dominated one wall covered in hand-drawn diagrams of today's training scenario. Urban breach and clear exercise. Staged in one of Blackstone's warehouse mock-ups. Sloan chose a seat in the second row, positioned where she could see both the instructor and track the room's dynamics. Around her, small clusters of trainees segregated themselves by branch. You could read the tribal affiliations in their posture, their patches, the way they held their weapons. The four Navy commandos had claimed a row near the back, sprawled in their chairs like they owned the place. Garrett's boots propped up on the chair in front of him. He was explaining something to the others in the tone of voice that suggested they should feel privileged to receive his wisdom. Major Billings entered precisely on time. Lean, gray-haired, the kind of authoritative presence that made conversation die without him saying a word. He began laying out the exercise parameters. 4-person assault team, timed breach and clear. Simunition rounds that hurt enough to demand respect but wouldn't leave permanent damage. Sloan took notes, her mind already mapping the scenario. She'd run variations of this drill hundreds of times, in training, in places where the targets shot back with real bullets. But halfway through Billings's briefing, Garrett raised his hand. Casual arrogance, like he was about to improve everyone's day with his brilliant insight. "Sir," he said, tone respectful enough on the surface, undertone suggesting something else. "Since today's exercise is supposed to test adaptability under stress, why don't we give the Army rep here a little extra challenge?" The room went quiet. Billings stopped mid-sentence, fixed Garrett with a stare that could have frozen boiling water. "What kind of challenge, Lieutenant?" Garrett's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Strip her weapons. Let her run the scenario unarmed. See how she adapts when she doesn't have her security blanket." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a bad cigar. Dalton leaned forward, adding his voice to the mix. "Could be good training, sir. Real world doesn't always give you time to grab your rifle." Beckett nodded sagely. "Besides, we'll still keep her on the team. Just level the playing field a little." Finley's snicker needed no translation. Sloan sat perfectly still, her expression revealing nothing while her mind calculated angles and possibilities. This wasn't about training. This was about 4 men who decided her quiet competence was somehow a challenge to their authority. "That's not how the scenario is designed," she said evenly. "This is a timed breach drill, not hand-to-hand combat training." Garrett's grin widened. "Exactly. So if you can still pull your weight without weapons, that proves something, doesn't it?" Major Billings looked uncomfortable. He'd clearly dealt with these commandos before, knew their reputation for pushing boundaries. The kind of men who confused arrogance with confidence, thought rules were suggestions for lesser people. Then he glanced up toward the observation window, made brief eye contact with someone Sloan couldn't see. A subtle nod passed between them. "Look," Billings said finally, "we'll try it for the first run. If there are problems, we'll adjust. Sergeant Brennan, surrender your weapons. You're going in unarmed." The order cut through the room like a blade. Refusing would make her look insubordinate in front of 50 witnesses. Complying would let these 4 jackasses think they'd scored a victory. Either choice came with a price. Sloan stood slowly, lifted her M4, walked it to the front table with measured precision. Her sidearm followed, leaving her holster empty and her options significantly reduced. She set both weapons down deliberately, not slamming them, but making it clear this wasn't submission. When she returned to her seat, the commandos were grinning like they just won the lottery. Beckett made a show of whispering something to Finley that set them both chuckling. Across the room, a couple of younger soldiers exchanged glances that clearly said she was about to get destroyed. Billings finished the briefing, dismissed everyone to the staging area. As chairs scraped against concrete and bodies moved toward the exit, Garrett passed close enough to Sloane's shoulder to murmur one last comment. "Hope you've been doing your yoga, Sergeant. You're going to need all the flexibility you can get." Sloane didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. But as she fell into step toward the warehouse, her mind was already shifting gears, cataloging joint locks, pressure points, the dozen ways to turn an opponent's weapons against them. If they wanted to see how she handled herself without a rifle, she'd give them a demonstration they'd never forget. What these four men didn't know could fill volumes, but three facts stood above the rest. First, Sloane Brennan was the daughter of General Thomas Hawk Brennan, the man who'd spent 35 years perfecting something called Falcon Protocol. Second, she'd been training in that protocol since she was 12 years old. 15 years of discipline that made it as natural as breathing. Third, Falcon Protocol wasn't about being the strongest person in the room. It was about being the smartest, the fastest. The one who understood that every weapon your opponent carried was a weapon you could use. And in about 10 minutes, four Navy commandos were going to learn that lesson the hard way. High above the briefing room, behind one-way glass in the observation deck, Colonel Archer Calloway stood with his arms crossed, watching everything unfold exactly as he'd orchestrated. 68 years old, silver-haired, ramrod-straight posture that hadn't bent in 5 decades of service. His dress greens carried enough medals to tell a story of valor spanning 3 wars and countless operations that would never make the history books. "You sure about this, sir?" Major Billings asked quietly beside him. Archer didn't take his eyes off Sloane's retreating form. "I'm sure. Those SEALs are going to eat her alive. No weapons against 4 armed men. That's not training, that's cruelty." The ghost of a smile touched Archer's weathered face. "Major, I've known that young woman since she was born. Held her when she was 3 days old. Watched her grow up on military bases from Germany to Georgia. And I'm telling you something important." He turned to face Billings directly, eyes sharp as broken glass. "Those 4 SEALs are about to receive an education in humility, and it's going to last exactly 79 seconds. Billings looked skeptical. "Sir, with all due respect, she's Army. Ground pounder. They're Navy Special Warfare operators. The skill gap—" "There is no skill gap," Archer interrupted. "There's a knowledge gap, and they're on the wrong side of it." He turned back to the window, memory pulling him backward through decades. Berlin, 1987, the Cold War still burning hot. Both sides dancing on the edge of nuclear annihilation. Archer had been 31 years old, running covert operations behind the Iron Curtain. The kind of work where capture meant torture and death, where success meant nobody ever knew you'd been there. His partner had been a 32-year-old Army intelligence officer named Thomas Brennan. Call sign Hawk, sharp eyes, sharper mind, the kind of operator who saw 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still processing move 1. They'd been extracting a Soviet defector from East Berlin. High-value target, scientist who knew things about Moscow's weapons programs that could shift the balance of power. The extraction went sideways. Bad intelligence. Ambush. Stasi security forces cutting off their exit route. Archer remembered the alley. Brick walls closing in. 3 Stasi agents ahead. 2 behind. Nowhere to run. He remembered Thomas stepping forward, empty-handed, the agents laughing, thinking they had easy prey. What happened next lasted maybe 30 seconds. But it changed everything Archer thought he knew about hand-to-hand combat. Thomas moved like water, like he was dancing instead of fighting. He used the first agent's rifle as a lever. Stripped it. Used it to take down the second. Disarmed the third with a joint lock that made the man scream. By the time the 2 agents behind them reacted, Thomas had 2 weapons and perfect positioning. The extraction succeeded. The defector made it to West Berlin. Intelligence changed the Cold War calculus for years. But what stuck with Archer wasn't the mission success. It was the question he asked afterward in their safe house, both of them nursing bruises and drinking cheap vodka. "Where the hell did you learn that?" Thomas had smiled, that quiet smile of his. "Been studying Soviet Sambo, Israeli Krav Maga, taking the best of both, building something new, something better." Why we've got standard combatives training. Standard training is for standard situations, Thomas said. But real combat is chaos. You need something that works when everything goes wrong, when you're outnumbered, outgunned, when all you've got is your body and your brain. And over the next 3 years, during gaps between operations, Thomas showed Archer what he was building: a complete system, not just techniques, a philosophy, an approach to violence that turned disadvantage into advantage. He called it Falcon Protocol, named after his own call sign, the bird of prey that struck faster than his target could comprehend. By the time the Cold War ended, Thomas had refined it to perfection. He'd used it in the field dozens of times, saved lives, completed impossible missions, built a reputation among those who knew. When the Gulf War came in 1990, Thomas served with distinction, taught his protocol to special operations soldiers who needed every advantage in Kuwait City's close quarters combat, men like a young Navy corpsman named Dalton Sterling. After the Gulf, Thomas retired from field operations, became an instructor, taught at Fort Bragg, at Quantico, at classified facilities whose names never appeared on any map. He trained Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Raiders, CIA operatives. He trained hundreds, maybe thousands. Most never knew the system had a name. They just knew it worked. And through it all, he had one student who learned more than anyone else. One student who absorbed every lesson, perfected every technique, understood not just the how, but the why. His daughter, Sloan. Archer remembered visiting Thomas's home in North Carolina when Sloan was 12. He'd found her in the basement gym, working a heavy bag with combinations that would have impressed professional fighters. "You teaching her?" Archer had asked. Thomas watched his daughter work, pride and fear warring in his expression. "She asked. I couldn't say no. But God, Archer, I'm terrified. What if she wants to serve? What if she ends up in combat?" "Then she'll be more ready than anyone else," Archer said. "You're giving her the best training in the world." "Training gets people killed," Thomas said quietly. "Overconfidence. Thinking you're invincible. I've lost students, Archer. Good people. I can't lose her." So Thomas pushed Sloan harder than anyone, demanded perfection, never satisfied, never praising, always finding the flaw, the weakness, the gap in her technique. It wasn't cruelty, it was love, twisted by fear, expressed through discipline. Sloan joined the Army at 18, deployed twice, Iraq, Afghanistan, came home with decorations and recommendations, requested assignment to combatives instruction. Thomas never told her he was proud, never acknowledged that she'd become exactly what he'd hoped for, a warrior who understood that true strength wasn't about dominance. It was about protection, about lifting others up, about passing knowledge forward. Cancer took Thomas 2 years ago, 61 years old, still strong, still sharp, until he wasn't. Archer visited him in the hospital 3 days before the end. Thomas could barely speak, morphine dulling the pain but clouding everything else. "Archer," he whispered, "promise me anything. Watch over her, but don't protect her. Don't let her hide behind my name. Make her prove herself, the way I should have let her prove herself to me." "I promise," Thomas gripped his hand. "I never told her that she was the best, better than me. I was afraid if I said it, she'd take risks. But I should have said it, should have told her every day. You can still. No time, you tell her. When she's ready, when she's proven it to herself, you tell her I knew, that I was proud, that she was everything I hoped she'd be." Thomas died the next morning, Arlington National Cemetery, full military honors, flag folded with precision. Sloan stood straight as steel, not crying, not showing anything, the way her father had taught her. Afterward, she requested transfer to Fort Blackstone. Routine instructor duty, low profile, like she was hiding. Archer couldn't allow that, so he orchestrated this. called in favors. Arrange for 4 arrogant Navy commandos to challenge her. Set up a scenario where she'd have to prove everything without weapons, without her father's name, without anything except the skill he had given her. It was cruel. It was necessary. It was what Thomas had asked for. "Sir," Major Billings said, pulling Archer back to the present. "They're staging now. 5 minutes until start." Archer nodded. "Good. Make sure the cameras are running. I want everything documented." "Why, it's just a training exercise." "No," Archer said quietly. "It's a legacy, and it's about to be born." The warehouse chosen for the exercise loomed like a steel cathedral, temporary plywood walls erected inside to create a maze of corridors and blind corners, the kind of layout that punished hesitation and rewarded decisive action. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that shifted with every movement. Sloane stood in the staging area outside the tape-marked entrance. She could feel the weight of eyes from the observation deck above. Word had spread through the base's gossip network faster than wildfire. The Army advisor was going in unarmed against 4 Navy commandos. The deck was packed, some genuinely curious, others hoping to see a train wreck. Garrett, Dalton, Beckett, and Finley moved through their pre-mission routine with the casual confidence of men who believed the outcome was already determined. Garrett slapped his magazine home with unnecessary force, the metallic click echoing through the space like a period at the end of a sentence. Dalton rolled his shoulders, working out tension. Beckett and Finley exchanged fist bumps like they were heading to a party instead of a training exercise. "Try to keep up in there, Brennan," Dalton called over his shoulder. "Wouldn't want you to get lost before the fun starts." Sloane knelt at the edge of the staging mat, adjusted her gloves with methodical precision. She didn't respond to the taunt, didn't even look up. Her attention focused on details these 4 hadn't bothered to notice. The way the lighting created blind spots in certain corners. How the plywood walls flexed slightly under pressure. The distinct sounds their gear made when they moved. Without weapons, she was theoretically at a massive disadvantage. But theory was just theory. Every piece of equipment these men carried was a potential tool in the right hands. Every moment of overconfidence was an opening. Every assumption about her helplessness was ammunition she could use against them. Sloane closed her eyes. Let her breathing slow. Let the world narrow to this single moment. She heard her father's voice. Not a memory. Something deeper. Knowledge burned so deep it became instinct. "Little hawk," he used to say during training. "Never fight their fight. Make them fight yours. Control the distance. Control the timing. Turn their strength into weakness." She remembered being 14, in the basement gym of their quarters at Fort Benning, Thomas drilling her on weapon retention for the 1,000th time. The rifle isn't their weapon, he'd taught her. It's an obstacle, a liability in close quarters. Long, awkward, requires space to maneuver. Get inside their guard, and it becomes your weapon. Understand? Yes, sir. Show me. And she had, again and again, until the movements lived in her muscle memory, until thinking became doing without conscious thought. She remembered being 16, Thomas teaching her the hip throw that had saved his life in Berlin. "This is pure Soviet Sambo," he'd explained. "Spetsnaz used it against larger opponents. Physics, not strength. You use their momentum, their mass, their assumption that size matters. Then you put them on the ground faster than they can process what happened. Why don't they teach this in basic training? Because it takes years to master. Most people want shortcuts, quick fixes. But you're not most people, are you?" "No, sir." "Prove it, again." She remembered being 22, fresh back from her first deployment in Afghanistan, meeting her father for dinner off base, civilian clothes, trying to be normal. "You did good work over there," he'd said. First time he'd ever acknowledged her service directly. "Your CO says you handled yourself well in Kandahar." Hope had fluttered in her chest. "Thank you, sir. But good isn't excellent, well, isn't perfect. When you go back, I want you to focus on..." And he'd launched into a detailed critique of her performance. Things she could improve, weaknesses she needed to shore up, gaps in her technique. No pride, no satisfaction, just more demands for perfection. She'd finished that dinner in silence, driven back to base with tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. Now kneeling in this warehouse, she understood. He hadn't been cruel, he'd been terrified. Every compliment would have felt like encouragement. Every word of pride like permission to take risks. He'd pushed her away because he loved her too much to lose her. But he was gone now, and all that remained was the training, the protocol, the legacy. Time to prove it was worth something. Major Billings' voice crackled over the loudspeaker. Team Alpha stack at the entry point. Scenario begins on my whistle. Objective is the green crate in the center room. 3 minutes on the clock. The commandos form their entry formation with textbook precision. Garrett on point, Dalton second, Beckett third, Finley bringing up the rear. Sloan found herself positioned 5 paces behind the stack, close enough to technically be part of the team, far enough back to be an afterthought once they hit the door. Up on the observation deck, she caught fragments of whispered conversation. 79 seconds. She'll be lucky to last half that. 4 against 1 and she's got nothing. This is going to be ugly. Garrett's been waiting for something like this. Sloan settled into a balanced stance, breathing slow and controlled. She'd been in rooms like this before. Only the walls had been stone instead of plywood, and the consequences had been measured in body bags instead of bruised egos. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The whistle shrieked through the warehouse like a starting gun, and Sloan Brennan, daughter of the Hawk carrier of the Falcon Protocol, moved forward into violence with the calm certainty of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. 79 seconds. That's all it would take to change everything. The commandos surged forward in perfect synchronization. Or so they thought. Sloan didn't follow directly behind them. Instead, she angled off to her left, using the wall for cover while cutting toward the first choke point before they'd even cleared the entrance corridor. The move was subtle, efficient, the kind of tactical adjustment that came from seeing patterns before they formed. The spectators on the observation deck leaned forward, some sensing that whatever was about to happen wouldn't match their expectations. Others still confident this would be a quick humiliation, a cautionary tale about knowing your place. They were all wrong. The first corridor was barely wide enough for 2 people to move abreast. Garrett took point, rifle up and ready, sweeping left and right with mechanical precision. Dalton stayed tight on his shoulder, 52 years old, but moving like a man 20 years younger, experience making up for any loss of speed. Beckett followed third, Finley anchoring the rear and already thinking about what they'd say in the debrief. Sloan held back, giving herself room, letting them commit to their formation, waiting for the moment when confidence became carelessness. Her left shoulder throbbed, deep ache spreading down her arm. The compression bandage underneath her BDU sleeve was tight, too tight, but necessary. The old injury from Kandahar didn't care about timing or importance. It just hurt. She'd taken 2 pain pills an hour ago, just enough to dull the edge without clouding judgment, but the medication was already wearing thin. She could feel it, the grinding in the joint, the weakness in movements that should have been strong. Her father's voice echoed across 3 years of memory. Pain is just information, little hawk. It tells you where your limits are. Then you decide whether to respect them or ignore them. Today she'd be ignoring them. 20 seconds in, they reached the first turn, a sharp left into what the exercise planners called an urban alley simulation. The walls closed in, the lighting shifted, shadows playing tricks with depth perception. Finley swung around the corner without checking his 6, his attention laser-focused forward, on the objective, on staying in formation, on not being the weak link that let the team down. It was the kind of tactical error that got people killed in real combat. The kind that happened when training became rote instead of reactive. When you stopped thinking and started following. In training, it just got you embarrassed. Sloan moved, not rushing, not hesitating, just flowing forward with the inevitability of water finding downhill. Her left hand clamped over his rifle barrel before he registered her presence, controlling the weapon, controlling the threat. Her right hand locked onto his wrist with precise pressure, finding the exact points where tendons and nerves crossed, where pain could override strength. Finley's eyes went wide, confusion flooding in. Then the first spark of real fear. The shoulder joint was the weak point, always had been. Thousands of years of human evolution and it remained vulnerable. a design flaw in the species, one her father had taught her to exploit without mercy. She twisted, sharp, controlled, not enough to dislocate, more than enough to send lightning up his arm, to make his grip on the rifle weaken involuntarily, the body protecting itself from damage, even as the mind screamed to hold on. Finley's cry of pain echoed off the plywood walls, high-pitched, shocked, the sound of someone discovering that confidence wasn't armor. Sloan pulled, breaking his balance, using his own mass against him. Physics not strength, leverage not force. Exactly like her father had drilled into her in that basement gym when she was 16 years old. The memory flickered, unbidden but welcome. Thomas Brennan standing over her, correcting her grip. Soviet Spetsnaz perfected this technique in Afghanistan, against Mujahideen fighters who were bigger, stronger, more experienced. Size means nothing when you control the joints. The weapon becomes yours. The fight becomes yours. Understand? Yes, sir. Show me, again. She'd shown him 1,000 times, 10,000. Until thinking became irrelevant, until the body simply knew. Now in this warehouse, that training bore fruit. Finley went down hard onto the padded floor, the impact driving air from his lungs in a strangled wheeze. Before he could process what had happened, before his brain could send signals to his limbs about fighting back, she stripped the rifle from his grip. Smooth, clinical, professional. The timer on the observation deck glowed in accusatory red. 32 seconds. She stepped over his prone form without looking down, already moving toward the next target, the pain in her shoulder spiking with each movement. Sharp, insistent, demanding attention she couldn't afford to give. Beckett heard the commotion behind him. His training kicked in faster than Finley's had. He spun, rifle coming up, eyes tracking for the threat. But he was already too late. By the time his brain processed what his eyes were seeing, Sloan was inside his guard. Inside the space where his rifle became a liability instead of an asset. She held Finley's captured weapon, used it like a lever, hooked it behind Beckett's knee with surgical precision. The exact angle, the exact pressure point. Beckett's legs were his pride. Hours in the gym, squats and deadlifts, building mass, building power. The kind of strength that made him feel invincible, that made him believe he could overcome anything through sheer force. But strength meant nothing when physics worked against you, when leverage turned your own mass into a weapon pointed at yourself. His eyes widened, recognition flooding in too late. He tried to adjust, to compensate, to use that impressive strength to stay upright. The laws of motion didn't care about his efforts. A sharp sweep and his legs were gone. 220 pounds of muscle meeting rubber mat at velocity. The thud echoed through the warehouse like a judgment being rendered. Sloan dropped, knee on his sternum. Just enough pressure to pin him, not enough to crack ribs. Her free hand came up, fingers finding the precise position on his neck. The carotid artery, the vagus nerve, the points where pressure could shut down consciousness in seconds. Blood choke. Israeli Krav Maga technique refined by Mossad operatives who needed to incapacitate targets silently, who couldn't afford gunfire or drawn-out struggles, who understood that efficiency was survival. Her father's voice again, memory mixing with present. The Israelis learned this during the Munich aftermath, when every operation had to be perfect, when failure meant international incident. They taught me in '86, I'm teaching you now. Pay attention to the angle. Too much pressure kills. Too little does nothing. Find the exact point where consciousness fades but life continues. How do I know when I've found it? Practice, repetition, and the willingness to make mistakes on training partners instead of in the field. She'd practiced. For years, on willing partners who trusted her to stop before real damage occurred, building the muscle memory, the understanding, the precision. Now that training manifested in perfect execution, Beckett's eyes went wide, panic overriding training, the primal fear of oxygen being denied, of the world going dark against your will. He tapped frantically against the mat. The universal signal, submission, defeat. Please stop. Sloan released immediately, shoved his rifle back at him without ceremony. Her shoulder screamed, white-hot pain lancing from joint to neck to fingertips. She glanced down. The compression sleeve showed a dark spot spreading, blood seeping through from the reopened wound. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Walter Reed Medical Center. Physical therapy room that smelled like antiseptic and crushed in dreams. The doctor examining her shoulder with professional detachment. The rotator cuff repair didn't take properly, Sergeant. Scar tissue, nerve damage. You'll never have full mobility again. Certainly not combat ready. I'm recommending medical discharge from field operations. She'd proved him wrong for 3 years. Pushed through the pain, adapted her techniques, found ways to compensate. Might be proving him right today. But not yet. Not while she still had 2 opponents standing. She pushed the pain down, deep, where it couldn't touch her, where it became just noise, just information to be filed away and ignored. The timer continued its merciless advance. 45 seconds. Garrett was beginning to understand that his brilliant plan had gone catastrophically wrong, that the assumptions he'd made were not just incorrect, but dangerous, that the woman he'd dismissed was something else entirely. He wheeled toward her, face showing the first cracks in his confidence, confusion bleeding through arrogance like ink through wet paper. His rifle came up, training taking over. But the narrow corridor that had been designed to favor the assault team now worked against him. Too long, too awkward, requiring space he didn't have and time he'd already lost. Sloan stepped right, fluid, inevitable, like water finding the path of least resistance. She let his momentum carry him forward, let his aggression become his weakness, the fundamental principle her father had spent a lifetime teaching. Never fight their fight, Thomas had said during one of their countless training sessions. Make them fight yours. Control the distance. Control the timing. Turn their strength into weakness. That's how David beats Goliath. Not with better weapons, with better understanding. Her left foot hooked behind Garrett's ankle. Simple. Clean. While her shoulder drove into his ribs. Not hard enough to break anything. Hard enough to send him off balance. Hard enough to make his inner ears scream contradictory messages about gravity and equilibrium. Garrett went sideways into the padded wall, the impact bone-jarring, the kind that knocked wind out and left you seeing stars, left you questioning what just happened and how the world had inverted so completely. His rifle slipped from his grasp. Natural response to the body's sudden need to protect itself from the wall instead of holding on to equipment. Sloan caught it before it hit the ground. Spun it into control position with practiced ease. Had it aimed at his center mass before he could draw his next breath, before he could process that he'd just been disarmed by someone half his size who wasn't even supposed to be a threat. He froze, face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. Confusion, anger, something that looked like respect trying to break through decades of prejudice, something that might have been fear, but felt more like recognition. Their eyes met. For one brief moment, the Sloan saw past the arrogance, past the bravado, saw the pain underneath. The loss he carried, the grief that had twisted into anger because anger was easier than vulnerability. She recognized it, had seen it in her own mirror often enough. The weight of losing someone, of carrying blame, of wondering if you could have done something different. But there was no time for that recognition to bloom into understanding. Not yet. One opponent remained. The timer glowed. 62 seconds. Dalton Sterling came around the corner with the grim efficiency of someone who'd heard enough chaos to know the mission had failed. But unlike the younger men, his face showed no surprise, no shock, just something that looked like grim satisfaction mixed with professional respect. He came fast and low, arms spread wide for a tackle. The kind of move that relied on experience and timing rather than just strength. The kind that had worked for him for 33 years, across 3 wars and countless training exercises. But he wasn't fighting to win. Sloan recognized that in his eyes. In the way he moved, he was fighting to confirm a suspicion, to test a theory, to see if what he thought was true actually was. She didn't fight his momentum. That was the mistake most people made. Trying to resist force with force. Trying to be stronger. To stand like an immovable object against an unstoppable force. Her father had taught her different. Soviet Sambo principle, he'd explained during one training session in Berlin. They'd been stationed there together briefly when she was 15, dependent living on base. him running classified operations she'd only learned about years later. You never resist momentum. You redirect it. You become the fulcrum. The opponent provides the force. Physics does the rest. She dropped her center of gravity. Let Dalton's mass carry him forward. Her hands found purchase on his sleeve and forearm. Grip points she'd practiced 10,000 times. Until her fingers knew exactly where to land without conscious thought. With a sharp pivot that drew on 15 years of repetition, she threw her hip across his line of attack. The fulcrum, the point around which everything else rotated. Dalton went airborne, just for a split second. But that moment probably felt like eternity. The moment when you realize gravity has betrayed you. When you understand that the ground is coming and there's nothing you can do to stop it. He crashed onto his back, the impact spreading across the mat like thunder. Professional enough to roll with it, experienced enough to minimize damage, but down nonetheless. Before he could recover, she'd stripped his sidearm, racked the slide in one smooth motion, had it aimed at his chest from less than 3 feet away. Perfect execution. Textbook Falcon protocol. The hip throw her father had learned in a Berlin alley in 1987. The technique that had saved his life. That had saved Archer's life. That had been passed down through decades of refinement and teaching. The throw that Dalton himself had been trying to perfect since Thomas Brennan taught him a version of it in Kuwait City 1991. Dalton lay on the mat, not struggling, just looking up at her with eyes that held understanding, recognition, confirmation. "You're Hawk's daughter," he said quietly. Only she could hear. A statement, not a question. Sloan nodded. Once. Subtle. "He'd be proud," Dalton continued, voice carrying weight that had nothing to do with volume. "That throw was identical to the one he taught me 33 years ago. I've been trying to perfect it ever since. You just showed me what perfect looks like." The timer stopped. 79 seconds precisely. The whistle blew. Sharp. Final. The sound of judgment rendered and accepted. Silence fell over the warehouse like a shroud. The only sounds were the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the ragged breathing of 4 men who just learned the difference between confidence and competence, between assumption and reality, between what they thought they knew and what they just experienced. Sloan straightened slowly, every movement calculated despite the exhaustion trying to creep in, despite the shoulder screaming, despite the adrenaline starting to fade and leave cold clarity in its wake. She handed the training pistol back to Dalton. Grip first, a gesture of respect between professionals, between warriors who understood what had just happened on a level deeper than victory or defeat. Then she stepped away from the scene, moving toward the gear rack with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout. No celebration, no gloating, no acknowledgement that she'd just done something remarkable. Just professional competence maintaining its composure. From the observation deck, the ripple started slow. One voice, then another, then a wave of conversation spreading through the crowd like wildfire through dry grass. Some muttering in disbelief, needing to verbally process what they'd witnessed because their brains couldn't quite accept it. Others chuckling in the nervous way people do when something defies their fundamental understanding of how the world works. The younger recruits were pointing, whispering urgently, their voices carrying fragments across the warehouse like scattered evidence of something important. "How did she move that fast? Did you see that throw on the chief? 4 guys, 4 of them, in less than 90 seconds, with her bare hands against rifles." One recruit leaned over to his buddy, voice barely contained with awe. "She just destroyed all 4 of them, like they were nothing, like it was choreographed." "That wasn't choreography," his friend replied. "That was mastery. There's a difference." Garrett struggled to his feet first, rubbing his shoulder where it had introduced itself to the wall with more force than either party had intended. His face flushed, deep red that spoke of exertion mixed with embarrassment, mixed with something else. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Finley remained on one knee, adjusting his gear like the act of straightening equipment might somehow restore the dignity that had been thoroughly stripped away. Not making eye contact with anyone, especially not the spectators who'd watched him go down in 32 seconds. Beckett avoided everyone's gaze, suddenly fascinated by his bootlaces, like they held secrets of the universe. Like if he looked at them hard enough, he could rewind time and make different choices. Dalton stayed seated on the floor for several long seconds, not because he couldn't stand, but because standing would make the defeat more real, more permanent, more impossible to rationalize away. But when he finally rose, his expression showed something the others didn't: understanding, respect. The look of someone who just confirmed a theory and was satisfied with the answer, even though it meant acknowledging his own defeat. Sloane said nothing. She didn't lecture, didn't gloat, didn't even look particularly satisfied. She just walked to the gear rack, hung up the borrowed equipment with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout, removed her gloves, adjusted her sleeve to cover the blood-spotted compression bandage. The timer above the entrance still glowed in accusatory red digits. 79 seconds. The number would haunt them, would become legend, would be repeated in whispers and stories across this base and others for years to come. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. It was the silence of minds being changed, of assumptions being demolished, of the world reorganizing itself around new information. Up on the observation deck, conversations died mid-sentence as people tried to process what they'd witnessed. Sloane Brennan, quiet, unassuming, supposedly outgunned, had just dismantled 4 elite operators without breaking a visible sweat, had made it look easy, inevitable, like the outcome had been predetermined and they were just actors playing out a script already written. Behind her, the commandos struggled to salvage what remained of their dignity. Garrett muttered something about lucky shots and unfair advantages, but his heart wasn't in it. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Defense mechanisms that couldn't quite defend against the reality of what had just occurred. Beckett busied himself with equipment that didn't need adjustment. Finley looked like he was having a serious conversation with his career choices and losing the argument. But Dalton just smiled, small, knowing, like he'd just confirmed something he'd suspected since that morning in the armory. Since he'd seen her move, since he'd recognized the stance and the efficiency and the way she assessed angles nobody else noticed. No one apologized. Not yet. No one acknowledged that maybe they'd misjudged everything from the beginning, that their assumptions had been built on prejudice rather than evidence, that they'd confused their expectations with reality. But something had shifted, in the air, in the energy of the room, in the way people looked at Sloane and at each other. That's when the slow clap started. It echoed through the warehouse with deliberate precision, not mocking but not quite congratulatory either, commanding attention in a way that made everyone look up toward the observation deck, made everyone stop what they were doing and focus. Colonel Archer Calloway stood at the railing, tall figure in dress greens that looked fresh despite the late morning hour. His silver eagles catching the fluorescent light and throwing small reflections across the space like scattered evidence of authority. He descended the metal stairs with presence that made grown men stand straighter without being told, made people adjust their posture and check their bearing without conscious thought. The kind of command presence that couldn't be taught or faked, only earned through decades of leadership. Each step on the metal stairs rang out, measured, inevitable, the sound of authority making itself manifest in the physical world. The warehouse held its collective breath. Archer stopped a few feet from Sloane, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to maintain the formality the moment required. He studied her with an expression that mixed professional assessment with something deeper, something that looked like pride trying to maintain appropriate distance. "Didn't expect to see Falcon back on the mats," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent space, each word chosen, each syllable weighted with meaning. The call sign hit the room like a physical blow, like someone had fired a shot into the ceiling. Garrett's head snapped up. Dalton's smile widened into something approaching satisfaction. Finley and Beckett exchanged confused glances that spoke volumes about how much they'd misunderstood. Falcon wasn't a nickname you earned teaching basic training at some backwater base. That was a designation that came from places where failure meant body bags and international incidents, where success was measured in missions that never made the news, where legends were born in darkness and lived in silence. Sloane's expression didn't change, maintained the same professional composure she'd shown throughout. "Been a while, sir." Archer nodded toward the 4 men still processing their defeat. Gentlemen, you might be interested to know that Staff Sergeant Brennan here comes from quite a distinguished lineage, a legacy of service and sacrifice that spans decades. He let the words hang, building tension, making them wait, teaching them that sometimes the most important lessons come wrapped in silence and anticipation. Her father was General Thomas Hawk Brennan. The name dropped like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward. Some of you might recognize that name. Cold War operative who served with distinction in Berlin during the late 80s, Gulf War hero who distinguished himself in Kuwait City, creator of something called Falcon Protocol. Dalton's expression shifted, recognition flooding in like a dam breaking. Hawk Brennan from Kuwait City, the one who saved 3rd Battalion from that ambush. The same, Archer confirmed, voice carrying satisfaction at the recognition. General Brennan developed a close-quarters combat system that drew from Israeli Krav Maga and Soviet Sambo, techniques he learned during covert operations behind the Iron Curtain, methods refined over 3 decades of service and teaching. He taught that system to NATO instructors, to JSOC operators, to half the special operations community across multiple branches. He paused. Let that information settle. Let it reorganize their understanding of what they'd just experienced. General Brennan died 2 years ago, cancer, 61 years old. But before he died, he spent 15 years training one student better than anyone else, teaching her everything he knew, every technique, every principle, every lesson learned from a lifetime spent in combat and teaching combat. Archer's gaze swept across all 4 commandos, making eye contact with each, making sure they understood. That student was his daughter, Staff Sergeant Sloan Brennan. What you just experienced, that was Falcon Protocol, perfected through 15 years of training under one of the greatest combat instructors this country has ever produced. The observation deck erupted, whispers becoming conversation, becoming a wave of sound, information spreading, reputations being reassessed, assumptions being demolished and rebuilt in real time. Garrett's face had gone pale, the color draining out as understanding flooded in. Finley looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. Beckett's earlier confidence had evaporated completely, leaving only the hollow shell of someone who'd fundamentally misunderstood reality. But Dalton stepped forward, expression serious, respectful, the look of someone who'd suspected and was now having that suspicion confirmed in the most official way possible. "Sir," he said, voice carrying the weight of experience and memory, "I served with General Brennan, Gulf War 1991. I was a 19-year-old Navy corpsman attached to Army Special Operations. General Brennan pulled me out of an ambush in Kuwait City. 3 insurgents had us pinned down. He went in alone, unarmed, neutralized all 3 in under a minute, then taught me the field combat techniques that saved my life 3 more times during that deployment." He turned to face Garrett and the others, making sure they heard this, making sure they understood the significance. That hip throw the sergeant used on me at 79 seconds, her father used that exact technique on me during training in 91. Taught it to me. I've been practicing it for 33 years. Thought I had it down, thought I'd perfected it. His smile was rueful, self-aware, the expression of someone capable of acknowledging his own limitations. "She just showed me I've been doing it 90% right, which means I've been doing it wrong. There's no partial credit in combat. Either the technique works or it doesn't." He turned back to Sloan, standing at attention, rendering respect. "I recognized you the moment you walked into the armory this morning. You move exactly like your father. Same stance, same efficiency, same way of seeing 3 steps ahead while everyone else is still processing step 1. A pause, heavy with meaning, with acknowledgement of something important. I stayed silent because I wanted to see if you'd earned the name, or just inherited it, if you were trading on his reputation, or if you'd built your own skill." His voice grew quieter, more intense, more personal. "You earned it, Sergeant, every bit of it. Your father would be damn proud. And as someone who owes his life to Thomas Brennan's training, I'm honored to have been on the receiving end of yours." For the first time since the exercise began, Sloane's composure cracked. Just slightly. Her eyes glistened, jaw tightening with emotion. She refused to let fully surface, refusing to cry, refusing to show weakness even in this moment of acknowledgement. but the emotion was there, raw and real and impossible to completely hide. "Thank you, Chief," she said quietly, voice steady despite the feelings underneath. "That means more than you know, more than I can properly express." The moment stretched, fragile, precious, the kind of acknowledgement that carried weight precisely because it was earned through demonstration rather than granted through courtesy. Then Garrett broke the spell. His voice came out harsh, defensive, hurt wrapped in aggression like armor that couldn't quite protect what it was meant to defend. "So what?" The words tumbled out, years of pain and prejudice mixing together. "She's got a famous father. That's supposed to make up for every time someone questions whether women belong in combat roles. Supposed to erase every mistake, every failure, every time someone dies because someone wasn't ready." His voice cracked, the armor breaking, revealing the wound underneath. "My own father spent 32 years in the Navy and never once said he was proud of me. Never acknowledged anything I accomplished. And my brother—" He stopped, took a breath, pushed forward despite the pain. "My brother Kyle died 2 years ago. Helicopter crash in Afghanistan. He was 24 years old. 4 men died that day because a pilot made an error under fire. And I've been angry ever since. Angry at the military for putting people in positions where mistakes are fatal. Angry at myself for not being there. Angry at—" He stopped again. Couldn't quite say it. Couldn't quite acknowledge the prejudice out loud. Sloane understood anyway. She had heard variations of this pain before. From others. From herself in dark moments when Emma's death felt like it was her fault. When the weight of command and the burden of decisions became too much. Archer started to respond, to address the outburst with command authority and official perspective. But Sloane raised her hand, subtle, asking for permission to handle this herself, to speak from experience rather than authority, from shared pain rather than rank. The colonel stepped back, giving her the floor, trusting her judgment. Sloane moved toward Garrett, not aggressive, not threatening, just closing the distance between them until she stood close enough to speak without the entire warehouse hearing every word. Close enough for this to be personal rather than public, human rather than military. "Your father's approval wasn't yours to earn, Lieutenant," she said, voice quiet but carrying absolute certainty, the certainty of someone who'd walked this path and survived it. "Neither was mine. We can't spend our lives seeking validation from people who don't know how to give it, who are broken in their own ways, who love us but can't express it in the language we need to hear." Garrett started to interrupt, to defend or deflect or deny. She kept talking, gentle but firm. "I didn't tell anyone my lineage because I wanted to be judged on my skill. Not my name, not my father's reputation, not the expectations that come with being someone's daughter. Just what I could do, what I'd earned through 15 years of training and 2 combat deployments and countless hours of trying to be worthy." She gestured subtly to the warehouse around them, to the timer still glowing 79 seconds, to the scene of his defeat and her victory. "My father died believing I'd never measure up. Not because I lacked skill. He knew I was good, better than most, but because I wasn't his son. Because in his mind, combat was a man's domain, and I was an anomaly, an exception he'd created but couldn't fully accept." Her voice carried emotion now. Raw, real, the kind of vulnerability that took courage to show. "He trained me harder than anyone, pushed me further, demanded perfection that nobody could achieve, and never once in 27 years told me I'd achieved it. Never said he was proud, never acknowledged that maybe I'd become exactly what he'd hoped for." She let that settle, let Garrett hear the parallel between their experiences. Let him understand that pain wasn't unique, that others carried similar weight. "I've spent half my life trying to prove I'm worthy of the Brennan name, trying to show that gender doesn't determine competence, that dedication and discipline matter more than biology. That skill transcends the assumptions we make about who can do what." She took a breath. "You 4 didn't lose today because you're inadequate. You're not. You lost because you assumed competence has a gender, because you let prejudice cloud your judgment, because you confused my quiet professionalism with weakness instead of recognizing it as confidence that doesn't need to announce itself." Sloane extended her hand, palm up, an offering, an invitation. a chance at something better. I don't want your apology. Apologies are easy. Words are cheap. I want you to be better. Learn from this. Grow from it. The next woman you serve with might save your life, if you let her. If you give her the respect you'd automatically give a man with identical credentials. Garrett stared at the hand, internal war visible on his face. Every muscle tense with conflict. Pride fighting humility. Prejudice fighting experience. The person he'd been for 32 years fighting the person he could choose to become. The warehouse held its breath, waiting, watching, understanding that something important was happening, that this moment would define who these men became after today. Finally, slowly, like a man approaching the edge of a cliff and deciding to jump anyway, Garrett reached out, took her hand, his grip firm, his eyes meeting hers with something new. Not quite respect yet, but the beginning of it, the seed that might grow into something real. "How did you move that fast?" he asked. Genuine curiosity replacing defensiveness. Real question replacing defensive posturing. "I've trained with the best. I thought I knew what elite looked like, but that was different. That was something else." Sloane's smile was small but genuine, the kind that came from recognizing a teachable moment, from understanding that this question was the first real step toward growth. "Want me to teach you?" The question hung in the air, an invitation, a challenge, an opportunity for something better than where they'd started. Garrett swallowed hard, pride finally breaking, fear of inadequacy giving way to hunger for improvement. "Yes, Sergeant, I do." The applause started small, one person on the observation deck, then another, then spreading like a wave until the entire warehouse was clapping. Not mockery, not celebration of defeat, just acknowledgement, recognition that something important had happened, that 4 men had learned humility, that 1 woman had proven her worth without destroying those who doubted her. That growth was possible even after profound mistakes. Archer Calloway watched it all unfold, seeing his best friend's legacy bloom into reality, seeing the promise he'd made 3 days before Thomas died finally fulfilled, seeing that 15 years of training and 2 years of grief had produced exactly what Thomas had hoped for. A teacher, a warrior, a leader who understood that true strength wasn't about dominance but about building others up, about making the next generation better than the last. The warehouse lights hummed overhead. The timer still glowed its accusation. 79 seconds that changed everything for everyone present. And in that moment, Sloane Brennan stood at the center of it all, not celebrating her victory, not gloating over their defeat, just ready to do what her father had spent his life doing, what he'd trained her to do, what she'd finally accepted as her purpose, teaching, building, making warriors better than they'd been, turning potential into reality through discipline and patience and the understanding that everyone deserves a chance to grow beyond their mistakes. The way it was always supposed to be, the way Thomas Brennan had always intended, the way Falcon Protocol would continue for another generation and beyond. 79 seconds, that's all it took to prove everything, to change minds, to shift paradigms, to demonstrate that assumptions were dangerous and skill was universal. But the real work that was just beginning. The gymnasium at Fort Blackstone smelled like every military gym Sloane had ever been in. Sweat, rubber mats, the faint tang of industrial cleaner fighting a losing battle against decades of human effort. 1900 hours, 7 o'clock in the evening. The base had settled into its nightly rhythm. Most personnel in the mess hall or barracks. The gym nearly empty except for the diehards who treated physical training like religion. Sloane stood in the center of the mat, still in her BDUs. She'd sent word through unofficial channels. Training session, voluntary. Anyone interested in learning Falcon Protocol fundamentals. She hadn't expected anyone to show. But at 18:55 the door opened. Finley Nash walked in, looked around nervously, spotted her, hesitated, then crossed to the mat with the uncertain gait of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. "Sergeant," he said, southern accent thick with uncertainty. "You said voluntary training." "I did." "Well," he shifted his weight, "I figure I could learn something, seeing as how you put me on my back in 32 seconds and all." Sloane gestured to the mat. "Drop your gear. We'll start with basics." The door opened again. Beckett Rhodes entered, saw Finley, saw Sloane, Some internal calculation happened behind his eyes. Then he nodded and moved to join them. Rhodes, Sloan acknowledged. Sergeant. He set down his gym bag. That technique you used on me, the blood choke. I've trained in chokes before, but that was different. Cleaner. I want to understand it. You will. 3 minutes later, Dalton Sterling arrived. He didn't offer explanations, just moved onto the mat with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly why he was there. At 1900 precisely, Garrett Wolfe stepped through the door. He stood in the entrance for a long moment, pride warring with pragmatism. The person he had been fighting, the person he was becoming. Then he crossed to the mat, met Sloane's eyes. Permission to join training, Sergeant. Granted. She gestured to the space beside the others. Fall in. The 4 men formed a line, standing at parade rest, waiting. Sloane looked at them, no, really looked at them. 4 hours ago, these men had mocked her, stripped her weapons, set her up for humiliation. 4 hours ago, they'd been adversaries. Now they were here, voluntarily, ready to learn. It was a start. Falcon Protocol, she began, isn't about being the strongest person in the room. It's about being the smartest, the fastest, the one who understands that every disadvantage can become an advantage. Every weakness in your opponent is a strength you can exploit. She moved to the center of the mat. My father spent 35 years perfecting this system. He drew from Soviet Sambo, from Israeli Krav Maga, from hard lessons learned in Berlin alleys and Kuwait City streets, from every mistake he made and every life he saved. Her voice grew quieter, more intense. He believed that combat wasn't about dominance. It was about survival, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, about passing knowledge forward so the next generation had a better chance of coming home. She paused, let those words settle. That's what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to teach you what he taught me, and you're going to take it seriously. Because someday, somewhere, this training might save your life, or the life of the person fighting beside you. 4 heads nodded, 4 men who hours ago had been arrogant, now humble, now ready. Finley, Sloane called. Center mat. The young corporal moved forward, still nervous, still uncertain. The disarm I used on you, she said. That's pure Soviet Sambo. Spetsnaz used it in Afghanistan in the 80s. The principle is simple. You don't fight the weapon. You control the person holding it. She had Beckett stand in as the armed opponent, demonstrated the technique in slow motion. Hand placement, the twist against the shoulder joint, the pull that broke balance. Your instinct is to grab the rifle and pull, she explained. But that puts you in a strength contest. And if he's stronger, you lose. Instead, you control the joints, the wrist, the elbow, the shoulder. Control those and his strength becomes irrelevant. She walked Finley through it, step by step, correcting his grip, adjusting his angle, patient, thorough, the way her father had taught her 1,000 times in that basement gym. Again, she said, slower this time. Feel where his balance breaks. That's the moment. That's when you execute. Finley tried again. Better, more controlled. When Beckett went down, it was smoother, more inevitable. Good, Sloane said. That's the foundation. Now we build on it. She rotated through each of them, teaching the techniques she'd used in the warehouse, breaking them down, explaining the principles behind each movement. For Beckett, the hip throw, the physics of leverage, how to use an opponent's mass against them. Israeli operatives perfected this for neutralizing larger opponents. She explained, it's not about strength, it's about geometry. You create a fulcrum with your hip. His body becomes the lever. Gravity does the rest. She demonstrated on Dalton. The older man went down clean, rolled smoothly, came up nodding with professional appreciation. Your father taught me a version of that in '91, he said, but this is cleaner, more efficient. He refined it over 30 years, Sloane said. Every time he taught it, he learned something new, made it better. That's what we do. We take what works and make it better. For Garrett, she focused on awareness, on reading an opponent's intentions before they acted. You charged me in that corridor, she said, aggressive, committed, but you telegraphed your intention 3 steps before you attacked. Your shoulders tensed, your grip shifted, your breathing changed. She had him practice recognizing those tells in others, learning to read the subtle signals that preceded violence. Cold War operatives lived by this, she said. In Berlin, in Prague, and Moscow, you had to know someone was a threat before they drew their weapon, because by the time they drew, it was too late. She moved close, spoke quietly so only he could hear. Your anger makes you obvious. It's written in every line of your body. An opponent who knows what they're doing will exploit that. Use your anger as a weapon against you. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he nodded, accepting the criticism. How do I fix it? Control, discipline, understanding that emotion in combat is a luxury you can't afford. Feel it later, process it later. In the moment, you have to be cold, calculated, precise. Something in his expression shifted. Recognition, understanding. Like you were today. Like I was today, she confirmed. The training session stretched. 1 hour became 2. Muscles warmed, techniques refined, and slowly, gradually, something else happened. The 4 men stopped being adversaries, started being students, started being something that might eventually become teammates. During a water break, Beckett approached Sloan, hesitant, uncertain how to phrase what he wanted to say. Sergeant, can I ask you something personal? Go ahead. Your father, when you were growing up, did he ever tell you he was proud? The question hit harder than any physical blow from the training session. Sloan took a long drink of water, buying time, deciding how honest to be. No, she said finally. Never, not once in 27 years. Beckett's face showed understanding, shared pain. My old man was the same, coal miner in Pennsylvania. Worked himself to death trying to provide for us, but he never said he was proud. Never said he loved us, just expected us to know. Did you know? Yeah, I knew, but hearing it would have meant something. You know, Sloan nodded. I know. Finley joined them. My daddy died when I was 16. Last thing he said to me was that I'd never amount to nothing. Just another Nash boy who'd end up drunk and broken in Appalachia. His voice was quiet, carrying old hurt. I joined the military to prove him wrong. But he's been dead 11 years, and I'm still trying to prove something to a ghost. We all are, Dalton said, walking over. That's what drives us. The need to prove, to measure up, to be worthy of something we were never quite sure we had. He looked at Sloan. Your father pushed you because he loved you, because he was terrified of losing you. I saw it in Kuwait, the way he trained us, hard, unforgiving, but always trying to give us the tools to survive. He lost 3 students over the years, Sloan said. Combat, training accidents, 1 suicide. Each one broke something in him, made him harder, made him push everyone away because caring hurt too much. Garrett had been listening from across the mat. Now he walked over. I lost my brother 2 years ago, Kyle. Helicopter crash in Afghanistan. He was 24. His voice cracked slightly. Female pilot made an error under fire. Flew into a kill zone. 4 men died. And I've been angry ever since. Angry at her. Angry at the military for putting women in positions I didn't think they belonged. Angry at myself for not being there. He looked at Sloan. Today when you put me into that wall, when I saw the look in your eyes, it wasn't hatred, it was pity. Like you understood exactly what I was carrying. I do understand, Sloan said. I lost someone too, a partner, a friend, Lieutenant Emma Cruz, Kandahar 3 years ago. I made the call that put her in the wrong position at the wrong time, and she died because of it. The gymnasium went quiet, the weight of shared loss hanging heavy. I left field operations after that, Sloan continued. Couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't risk making another call that got someone killed. My father never said it, but I know he was relieved. Finally, his daughter was safe. She looked at each of them. We're all carrying something, all trying to prove something, all haunted by people we couldn't save or couldn't satisfy. That's what makes us who we are. But it doesn't have to define us, Garrett said slowly. Does it? No, Sloan agreed. It doesn't. We can honor the dead by being better, by learning, by making sure the next person has a better chance than the ones we lost. Beckett extended his fist. To being better. Finley bumped it. To learning. Dalton added his. To making sure the next generation survives. Garrett hesitated, then completed the circle. to letting go of anger and choosing growth. Sloan placed her hand atop theirs, to carrying the legacy forward. 5 people who'd been enemies 12 hours ago. Now something different. Not quite friends yet, but not enemies anymore either. Something forged in combat and tempered in understanding. The training session continued another hour, but something had fundamentally changed. They weren't just learning techniques. They were building trust, the kind that couldn't be ordered or manufactured, the kind that had to be earned through shared vulnerability and mutual respect. By the time they finished, it was nearly 2,200 hours. 10 o'clock, the base settling into night watch routines. Same time tomorrow, Finley asked. Same time, Sloan confirmed. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Sergeant, Garrett said, thank you for today, for tonight, for not making this harder than it had to be. That's not how my father would have done it, Sloan said. He believed in building people up, even when they didn't deserve it yet. Did we deserve it after this morning? Sloan smiled, small but genuine. You're here, aren't you, willing to learn, willing to admit you were wrong. That's worth more than you know. They filed out, exhausted, humbled, changed. Sloan remained on the mat, alone in the quiet gym, surrounded by ghosts and memories. She could almost hear her father's voice, almost see him standing in the corner. That ghost of a smile he got when a student finally understood something important. I hope I'm doing this right, Dad, she whispered to the empty air. I hope this is what you wanted. The gym offered no answers, just echoes in silence. But somewhere in her chest, something felt lighter than it had in 2 years. Purpose, direction, the sense that maybe, just maybe, she was finally on the right path. 2,300 hours, 11 o'clock. Sloan stood outside Colonel Archer Calloway's office, the admin building mostly dark, just a few lights burning where late-night work demanded attention. She'd received the message an hour ago. Terse, official, report to the colonel's office at 2,300 hours. She knocked. 3 sharp raps. Enter. Archer sat behind his desk, still in uniform despite the late hour, 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon on the desk between them. The good stuff, not the rot gut from the officers' club. Close the door, he said. Sit down. Sloan complied, settled into the chair across from him, waited. Archer poured 2 glasses, slid one across to her. You did good work today. Thank you, sir. But you know it was orchestrated, don't you? I suspected as much when Major Billings looked to you for approval before ordering me to surrender my weapons. Archer nodded, sipped his bourbon. I need to tell you why. He stood, moved to the window, looked out over the darkened base. Fort Blackstone's Command Council has been debating the future of advanced combatives training for 6 months. Budget cuts, modernization initiatives, the usual bureaucratic nonsense. He turned back to face her. 3 weeks ago they voted. Falcon Protocol training was officially designated as obsolete, too old-fashioned for modern warfare, too focused on hand-to-hand combat in an era of drones and precision strikes. Sloan felt something cold settle in her stomach. They're shutting it down. They were going to shut it down, Archer corrected, until I called in 35 years of favors and got them to agree to one final demonstration. Proof of concept. Show that Falcon Protocol still has value in modern combat operations. Understanding flooded in. Today wasn't about humiliating me. It was about proving the system works. Today was about saving your father's legacy, Archer said bluntly. If you'd failed, Falcon Protocol would be officially retired, deleted from training curricula, forgotten within a generation. He moved back to his desk, sat down heavily. But you didn't fail. You proved publicly and undeniably that your father's system works. That skill and discipline and understanding can overcome numerical advantage and superior firepower. Those 4 men could have seriously hurt me, Sloan said quietly. They could have, Archer agreed, but I knew they wouldn't, because I've watched you train since you were 12 years old. I've seen what you can do, and I knew that if anyone could carry your father's legacy forward, it was you. Sloan stared at her untouched bourbon. Processing. You used me. I did, Archer said without hesitation. And I'd do it again, because sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to put everything on the line for what they believed in. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. her name written on the front in her father's handwriting. Thomas gave me this 3 days before he died, Archer said. Made me promise to give it to you when you were ready, not before. He was specific about that. He slid the envelope across the desk. I think you're ready now. Sloane picked it up with trembling fingers. The paper felt fragile, precious, terrifying. I'll give you privacy, Archer said. He stood, moved toward the door, paused. For what it's worth, Sloane, your father was my best friend for 35 years. I knew him better than anyone except maybe you, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that he was proud of you. He just didn't know how to say it. Then he left, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving Sloane alone with her father's final words. She stared at the envelope for a long time, afraid of what it might say, afraid of what it might not say. Finally, she opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten, her father's neat, precise script. Sloane, it began, if Archer is giving you this, it means I'm gone, and it means you've done something that proved you don't need my approval anymore. But I'm going to give it anyway, because I should have given it years ago. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard, kept reading. You are the best student I ever trained, not because you're my daughter, but because you understood something I spent most of my life trying to teach. Combat isn't about destroying your enemy. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. It's about passing knowledge forward. It's about building instead of breaking. I pushed you away, I know that. I was hard on you in ways I was never hard on anyone else. But it wasn't because I didn't think you were good enough. It was because I was terrified of losing you. I lost 3 students over my career. Jackson in Mogadishu, Williams in a training accident at Bragg, Kowalski to suicide 6 months after discharge. Each one broke something in me, made me harder, made me push everyone away because caring hurt too much. You were the best of all of them, better than me in a lot of ways, and that terrified me more than anything, because I knew that if you were good enough, you'd seek out the dangerous assignments. The real combat, the places where skill might not be enough to keep you alive. So I never told you that you'd succeeded, never acknowledged that you'd mastered everything I tried to teach, because I was afraid that if you knew how good you were, you'd take risks I couldn't protect you from. That was selfish. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. I'm dying now, cancer, the enemy I can't outfight or outthink, and my biggest regret isn't the missions that failed or the enemies that escaped. It's every day I didn't tell you I was proud. Every training session I criticized instead of praised. Every moment I put fear ahead of love. So I'm telling you now, I'm proud of you, not just for the soldier you became, but for the person you are. You're stronger than I ever was, kinder, more patient. You understand that building people up is harder than tearing them down, and more important. Falcon Protocol is yours now. Do with it what you think is right. Change it, improve it, make it yours instead of mine. That's what legacy is supposed to be. Not preservation, evolution. The next generation taking what works and making it better. I love you. I always have, even when I didn't know how to show it. Even when fear made me push you away. You were everything I hoped you'd be, and more than I had the courage to acknowledge. Fly high, little hawk. Make the world better than I left it. That's all any of us can hope for. Dad, Sloane sat in the quiet office, tears running freely down her face, reading and rereading the words she'd needed to hear for 15 years. The acknowledgement she'd chased through 2 deployments in a decade of service. The pride that had always been there, but never spoken. The office door opened quietly. Archer stepped back in, saw her face, understood immediately. He moved around the desk, did something he'd never done in all the years she'd known him, pulled her into a hug, paternal, protective, the embrace of someone who'd watched her grow up and loved her like his own. He meant every word, Archer said quietly. He told me the same things before he died. How proud he was, how scared, how much he regretted not saying it sooner. Sloane couldn't speak, could only hold on to this connection to her father. This last gift he'd left her. They stood like that for several minutes, grief and gratitude mixing together, the pain of loss and the relief of finally understanding. Finally, Sloane pulled back, wiped her eyes. Thank you. For this. For today. For everything. Thank your father, Archer said. He planned most of it. The scenario, the test, the timing. He knew you'd need to prove yourself, knew you'd never accept being handed anything. So he arranged for you to earn it. He moved back to his chair. The Command Council voted this afternoon. Based on today's demonstration, Falcon Protocol training is officially reinstated, not just as elective, as required curriculum for all Special Operations personnel assigned to Fort Blackstone. Sloane's head snapped up. Sir. Furthermore, Archer continued, you're being promoted to lead instructor, building a program, training the trainers, making sure your father's legacy continues for the next generation. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Say you'll do it. Say you'll take what Thomas built and make it better. Because that's what he wanted, what he planned for, what he believed you could do. Sloane looked at the letter in her hands, at her father's words, at the legacy being offered. Yes, she said. Yes, sir, I'll do it. Archer smiled. Outstanding. You start Monday, first class at 0600, and I believe you already have 4 motivated students. Those 4 might need remedial work, Sloane said, managing a small smile through tears. Then teach them, build them up, make them better. That's what your father would do. That's what you do. Morning came to Fort Blackstone with the clarity of desert sunrise, the sky bleeding from black to purple to red to gold. Colors so vivid they looked painted. The main parade ground filled with personnel at 0800. Formation. Dress uniforms. The kind of official ceremony that signaled something important happening. Sloane stood at attention in the front rank, uncertain why she'd been summoned, knowing it had something to do with yesterday, but unclear on specifics. Colonel Calloway took the platform, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled ranks. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday this base witnessed something remarkable, an exercise that was meant to demonstrate adaptability under adverse conditions instead demonstrated something far more important. He paused, let the words sink in. It demonstrated that skill, discipline, and dedication transcend gender, transcend expectations, transcend the prejudices we carry with us. Staff Sergeant Sloane Brennan, daughter of the late General Thomas Brennan, demonstrated combat expertise that neutralized 4 armed Special Operations personnel in 79 seconds, using only hand-to-hand techniques, against superior numbers and firepower. The assembled personnel stood in absolute silence, hundreds of faces watching, listening. More importantly, Archer continued, she demonstrated the value of a combat system that some in command had designated obsolete. Falcon Protocol, created by General Brennan over 3 decades of operational experience, proved its continued relevance to modern warfare. Therefore, effective immediately, Falcon Protocol is reinstated as required training for all Special Operations personnel assigned to this base, and Staff Sergeant Brennan is promoted to lead instructor with full authority to build a comprehensive training program. Applause rippled through the formation. Not polite acknowledgement, real appreciation, respect earned through demonstration. Archer gestured Sloane forward. She climbed the platform steps, stood at attention before him. Sergeant Brennan, your father served this country with distinction for 35 years. He saved lives, trained warriors, built something that will outlive us all. Today we honor his memory by entrusting his legacy to you. He pinned new rank insignia on her collar. Technical Sergeant, E6. Promotion ahead of schedule, earned through excellence. Make us proud, Sergeant. Make your father proud. Build something that lasts. Yes, sir, Sloane said, voice steady despite emotion. I will. The formation dismissed. Personnel flooding forward. Congratulations. Questions about training. Request to enroll in classes. But 4 men pushed through the crowd first. Garrett Dalton Beckett and Finley, standing at attention before her. Sergeant Brennan, Garrett said formally, we request permission to enroll as your first students in advanced Falcon Protocol training. Sloane looked at them. These men who'd mocked her 24 hours ago, who'd tried to humiliate her, who'd learned humility the hard way. Permission granted, she said. Training begins Monday at 0600. Don't be late. We won't be, Sergeant, Garrett said, then quieter, thank you. for giving us a second chance, for teaching us instead of destroying us. That's not who I am, Saini said. That's not who my father was. We build, we don't break. 1 week later, Monday morning, 05:45, the training facility's main hall filled with personnel, 43 students total, men and women both, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, every branch represented. Garrett, Dalton, Beckett, and Finley sat in the front row. Notebooks ready, eager, changed. Sloan stood before them, technical sergeant insignia bright on her collar, her father's manual in her hands, pages worn from decades of use. Falcon Protocol, she began, isn't about being the strongest person in the room. It's about being the smartest, the fastest, the one who understands that every disadvantage can become an advantage. She looked across the assembled faces, young, eager, waiting to learn. My father created this system 35 years ago. He drew from Soviet Sambo, from Israeli Krav Maga, from hard lessons learned in places most of you have never heard of, from every mistake he made and every life he saved. He believed that combat wasn't about dominance. It was about protection, about giving soldiers the tools to survive, about passing knowledge forward so each generation has a better chance than the last. She paused, let her gaze sweep across them all. Today, we begin that process. I'm going to teach you what he taught me, and you're going to take it seriously, because someday this training might save your life, or the life of the person fighting beside you. In the back row, a young private raised her hand, 22 years old, fresh-faced, uncertain. Sergeant, will you train us as hard as your father trained you? The question hung in the air, everyone waiting for the answer. Sloan thought of her father, of 15 years of training, of criticism and demands and the constant push for perfection, of love expressed through discipline because he didn't know any other way. Harder, she said, because you're going to train the next generation after me, and they deserve the best we can give them. The students nodded, understanding, accepting. In the front row, Garrett smiled, small but genuine, the smile of someone who'd found purpose beyond anger. Sloan opened her father's manual, began the first lesson, and somewhere in whatever came after she liked to think Thomas Brennan was watching, finally able to say the words he'd struggled with in life. That's my daughter, and I'm proud. Arlington National Cemetery, late afternoon, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. Sloan walked the familiar path between white headstones, each marker a life given in service, each name a story of sacrifice. Her father's grave stood in Section 60, where the recent wars were buried, where fresh flowers appeared regularly despite him being gone 2 years. She knelt before the simple white marker. Thomas James Brennan, General, United States Army, decorated veteran, beloved father. The Medal of Commendation from her promotion sat in her palm. She placed it gently at the base of the headstone. Alongside the flowers someone else had left, probably Archer. He visited regularly. I did it, Dad, she said quietly. Falcon Protocol lives on. Your legacy continues. And I finally understand what you were trying to teach me all those years. A breeze moved through the cemetery, stirring leaves, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant roses. You weren't pushing me away. You were preparing me to carry something bigger than both of us, preparing me to teach, to build, to make the next generation better than we were. She traced his name on the stone. I got your letter. Archer gave it to me last week. And I want you to know something. I forgive you for not saying the words, for pushing so hard, for letting fear control you, because I understand now. Love and fear are complicated, especially when you've lost people you cared about. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind her. She didn't turn, knew who it was by the sound. Garrett's voice came quietly. We didn't mean to intrude, Sergeant, but we wanted to pay our respects. Sloan looked back. All 4 of them stood at a respectful distance, garrison caps in hand, standing at attention before a fallen warrior's grave. He would have liked that, she said. He always said the measure of a teacher is the students who remember him. They moved closer, formed a line beside her, looking down at the grave of a man they'd never met but whose legacy had changed their lives. I looked up his service record, Dalton said. Decorated in Desert Storm, served in Berlin during the Cold War. Taught at Fort Bragg, Quantico, in a dozen classified facilities. Trained thousands of soldiers. And his greatest student, Beckett added, was the daughter he never told he was proud of. He told me, Sloan said. Eventually, in the only way he could. Finley knelt, placed his hand on the headstone. Thank you, General, for teaching your daughter, for creating something that saves lives, for giving us a second chance even though you never knew we'd need one. They stood in silence. 5 soldiers honoring one, the living acknowledging the dead, the present respecting the past. Finally, Garrett spoke. Sergeant, we need to get back for evening formation. But we wanted to tell you something first. What's that, Lieutenant? We're not just your students. We're going to be your advocates, your assistants. Whatever you need to build this program. To honor your father's legacy. To make sure Falcon Protocol thrives for the next 35 years. And beyond, Dalton added. Count us in, Beckett said. For as long as you need us, Finley finished. Sloan stood. Faced them. These men who'd been enemies, who'd become students, who were becoming something more, brothers and sister in arms, united by shared purpose. Thank you, she said. That means more than you know. They saluted. Not her. The grave. The man who'd started all of this, whose vision and sacrifice had brought them together. Then they turned and walked back toward the cemetery entrance, leaving her alone with her father one final time. Sloan looked down at the headstone, at the name carved in marble, at the legacy it represented. Fly high, little hawk, she whispered, echoing his words, accepting his challenge. I'll make you proud, I promise. The sun touched the horizon, painting the cemetery in gold and shadow. Life and death intermingling in the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, a bugler played taps, the mournful notes carrying across the endless rows of white stone. The daily ritual, the eternal goodbye. Sloan stood at attention, rendered final salute to her father, to his memory, to the man he'd been and the legacy he'd left. Then she turned and walked toward the entrance, toward her waiting students, toward the future she was building. Behind her, if she'd looked back, she might have seen the headstone catch the last rays of sunlight, might have seen it glow for a moment like it was alive, might have heard in the wind moving through ancient oaks a voice she knew better than any other. That's my daughter, it seemed to say, and I'm proud. But Sloan didn't look back. She walked forward, the way her father had taught her, the way warriors always do, because the past was for honoring, but the future was for building, and she had work to do. The story of the Falcon wasn't ending, it was just beginning. Passed from father to daughter, from teacher to student, from generation to generation. 79 seconds had changed everything, but the legacy would last forever.